do the introduction. So I'm David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center and the head of the Sustainability Solutions Initiative. It's a delight to have Frank Drummond here today and to have you, and glad you, if you haven't tried the pie yet, go for it, because it won't last that long. So I realized I met Frank when I first came here to interview for a job 7 years ago, and it didn't take me long at all to see that he was exactly the kind of person who I thought made this institution really special, because a lot, just like Mainers that have many different kinds of jobs, a typical kind of deep cultural norm in Maine, Frank has many different kinds of jobs. Of course, he's a brilliant ecologist. He's an expert in ecology and evolution, statistical modeling, computer simulation, he's a lot of other things. I don't know how to operate a skidder, but I think everybody else in Maine knows how to do that. He, in that vein, he's just done deep stakeholder engagement for decades. A real committed and experienced in interdisciplinary collaboration. Always about solutions, trying to help not just understand problems but solve problems. So, in a way, most of the ideas that kind of came forth and became the Sustainability Solutions Initiative came from interactions with people like Frank, that we just wanted to see how we could grow this. And the weird part is that after getting all sorts of good ideas from Frank, he actually wasn't a central figure in the work of SSI early on. And for me, this is partly and yet he's gone off and done some work that has a big interdisciplinary team. Are there 60 people involved in this project around? Okay, well there's a lot, and major funding across other projects, lots of collaborators, lots of funding from different sources, dealing with issues like colony collapse disorder, earlier managing the blueberry maggot fly. You may know there's a new pest species in Maine, this spotted wing Drosophila, and I noticed a report in July that it had just been discovered in Winterport, Maine, and I started to worry, because I worry if the people who are out looking for these kind of threats are doing random sampling or bias sampling, and the fact that the blueberry barren, where I believe that fly was discovered, is right next to Frank's house in Winterport, makes me think maybe he just went out the back door and swept a net, which I'm not sure if that counts as real science or not, Frank. But I'm delighted to have him here today to talk about this big project he's involved in, that when he first described it to me, he said, oh, it's kind of like an SSI project, except we got funding a different way. And so it's a great opportunity to learn, and as SSI moves into the next phase, we're about to have a name change and become the Center for Sustainability Solutions. We're looking to kind of make sure people like Frank and his colleagues are key parts of the future of our work, where that might be possible. So, final thing, Frank, an expert in blueberries, was the first to taste the pie, and he says, we're good to go. So I'll get back to Dyserts about that, Frank. Welcome.
I have to say that was the nicest introduction I think I've ever received, and for a while there I was wondering, who is he talking about? But thank you. So I have been working on and off in pollination and native pollinators for now almost 25 years. And so I thought I'd like to talk a little bit about the structure of a project that several of you in this room are part of, from my perspective. And so you may not quite recognize this project, but hang in there. But it's focused on what's referred to as sustainability in pollination, or pollination security. And so I'm just going to start off here with pollination being known as maybe one of the more important ecosystem services that are mediated by insects. And so the question is, really, is it an ecosystem service that's valued? And I want you to think also about how we might think about it in Maine. So we live in the most forested state in the continental U.S. Right now, I think the estimate's up to 93% forest. And so that's important, because forested landscapes are not bee-friendly landscapes for the most part. Forest edges are optimal habitats for one group of bees, in particular bumblebees, but sort of dense coniferous boreal forest is very inhospitable to bees, and that makes up a fairly large part of the state, the north and western part of the state. And in the transition zone in Maine, it's sort of more of an upland deciduous forest. Again, not real ideal for bees. And so I'd like you to think about this a little bit. Is this ecosystem service something that we want to conserve? Is it something that we want to modify the landscape in order to conserve it? About 10 years ago, I was in England on a sabbatical for about 6 months. And it's interesting, when you talk to the conservation biologists there, they have a very different opinion on what are the important sort of landscapes to preserve. And for many of the Europeans, it is the human-managed landscapes that have existed since the Iron Age in Europe that are considered worth conserving. And it is not necessarily the pristine sort of, if you want to call it, natural landscapes, where when you come to the United States, that seems to be the major focus on conserving landscapes, is to conserve the natural ones, and the human-managed landscapes are thought to be sort of maybe less of a priority. So the point is here is that we're talking about animals that at one time were probably more diverse, more abundant, just before the Europeans came to North America, and probably increased in abundance when farming resulted in a lot of cleared land and erosion on the land, which let a lot of herbaceous plants take hold. And now we're in a phase where we're actually losing the types of landscapes that foster these ecosystem service animals. So here's a bumblebee, actually, the white-fringed bumblebee from South America, visiting a flower for resources. Now, as far as sort of more of a North American perspective, 80% of the plant species in the U.S. are animal pollinated. And all the fruits and nuts, many of the vegetables that you eat, are animal, mostly insect pollinated. So indeed, it would be a bland diet if we didn't have insect pollination. About 15 billion is sort of a back of the envelope calculation of the value just of bees in the U.S. And the honeybee is considered the workhorse, an exotic insect from sort of the Mediterranean region and Western Asia, and maybe also part of the problem, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But bees are dominant when you think about crop pollinators. So there are lots of other different animals that pollinate crops. Hummingbirds are out on the blueberry barrens, bats pollinating more tropical crops, butterflies and moths. But bees are dominant, especially in the Northeast. And in Maine, there are 257 species of bees. And to put that a little in perspective, there are about 20,000 bees in the world. There are about 2,000 in the U.S., about 700 species in Arizona, about 450 species in New York State, and a paltry 257 in Maine. So really, this is a depauperate diversity that we have in Maine that we're talking about. And that's typical that as you move up in latitude, diversity of bees tends to fall off, except for the bumblebees, which increase in diversity. So as I mentioned, 257 species. This would be a very common sight in the spring. How many people have seen this particular insect? So this is the orange-belted bumblebee. Nice name. It has this, couple of segments with this bright sort of rusty orange band. One of our more common bumblebees. And It's found all over the state. It's adept at pollinating blueberry, but of those 257 species, we found 134 species just associated with this wild plant, Vaccinium angustifolium, the lowbush blueberry. But if you walk around in the spring, not only will you see bumblebees coming out maybe mid-April, and some small soil nesting bees, but you'll see this animal too. And this is Apis mellifera, the European honeybee. And it's really, it is definitely an exotic species, but it's been here as long as any of our ancestors. So 1624 is when it was first brought over. And in fact, I think, Mike, you sent me an email many years ago that someone asked you something about dandelions. And in fact, dandelions are sort of the poster child for pollinators in the U.S. because when honeybees were brought over in New England, there were very few spring flowering plants that could support honeybee colonies. And honeybees provided sweetener, wax for candles, as well as pollination, pollinated apples for cider. But there weren't a lot of nectar and pollen resources, and so dandelions were brought over specifically to promote honeybees and allow them that early population growth. And so next time you see dandelions in your lawn, hold off. Don't dig them out. That they have a long history as a honeybee. So we can talk a little bit about honeybees, and because they're so prevalent in U.S. cropping systems, and these are a couple of figures that I stole from one of my grad students who gave an excellent talk a couple weeks ago. And what this top graph on the top right shows is growth in bee-dependent crops in the U.S. So this is a change in agricultural production in percent since the 1960s. And this purple line on the top that's exponentially increasing are those crops that are dependent on bees for pollination. So we are producing more and more bee-dependent crops. But what this graph shows is the honeybee populations in the United States measured in numbers of colonies, and this is millions. And you can see right after World War II, they peaked at about 6 million colonies. And now they're down to about 2.3, 2.4 million colonies. So there's been this dramatic decline in honeybee populations over time. And so honeybees are a scarce resource, that they're increasing needs and yet a declining stock. And part of this talk was talking about the cowgirls, and the honeybees are the real cowgirls. They're generalists, they're brought to every single crop. They pack pistils of flowers, and they also have sort of a real cowgirl lifestyle, is that they travel all around the United States on big tractor-trailer trucks, and they make somewhat migratory journeys up and down the northeast coast, but also some major travels across the entire United States, from pollinating almonds in California to blueberries in Maine. And I think out of the 75,000 colonies that come into Maine every year for blueberry pollination, which is the second greatest number of colonies that are brought into a state for pollination, California's number one with 1.4 million. Almost 60% of all the honeybee colonies are brought into California for almonds. But out of that 75,000, about 20,000 come make this western trip from California. And several of them come up from Texas or from Florida and Georgia. So there's this large continental mass movement of this animal, which is not occurring with any of the native bees. Well, many of you may have heard of CCD, colony collapse disorder. If you haven't heard about it, then you've been living in a vacuum. And it first came onto the scene in 2006, both in Europe and the United States and Canada almost simultaneously, and then some incidence of it has been found in sort of Eastern Europe and Western Asia, and it was quite mysterious. It ended up in just massive losses. About half of all those colonies in the United States just died in 2006. And it was this really mysterious disorder that a beekeeper would go out and look at the bees on one day, and they'd be very strong with maybe 50,000 bees in a colony, and then they'd go out 2 weeks later, and there was maybe 100 bees with the queen, and thousands of larvae that were starving to death because there weren't enough workers to feed the bees, but there were no dead bees around, almost as if someone had just picked up all of the workers and taken off. And then the beekeeper would go out there a week later and there'd be nothing left. Just dead larvae and no adults in the colony. And what was even more peculiar about it is if you took the wooden equipment and tried to put new honeybees in it, they would reject it. So there's something about this equipment that prevented new bees from taking up residence. So it was really something that had been mentioned 100 years ago and 200 years ago, but not understood and not seen for a long time. And it's mostly been associated with these businesses that truck bees across the country. 1 million hives out of 2.4 million were lost in 2006. From then on, about 30% of the colonies in the U.S. die every single year. So it's still massive. Think of running a business where 30% of your inventory, you lose it every year. And associated with that, there was a feeling, but not really good data, that other pollinators were in decline too. Many of the native bees, it was thought, were in decline. And so people were thinking, is this related to CCD? And so 7 years later, still not really well understood. Lots of research attention. Over a decade ago, most beekeepers had 10 to 15% loss. Now they're having 35% loss. And it's increasingly difficult to raise honeybees. And so, it was thought, well, maybe this is linked to the global bee trade, which is a huge smuggling operation. And many folks thought that maybe there was some nasty pathogens or diseases that might have been linked to this. And so I'm just going to digress a little bit and talk about this because I've been involved in a national project. It was a $5 million project to look at CCD over the last 4 years. And so all of the top honeybee researchers in the country met in 2008 and came up with this sort of untestable hypothesis that it must be everything. It's a multiple stressor hypothesis. Everything is just the last straw that broke the camel's back, and it's diseases, macroparasites, insecticides, other factors are overlaid on this, such as poor nutrition, limited genetic diversity in honeybees. This has definitely got to be the cause. And so these are just some of them real quickly. This is a parasitic mite in the trachea, the breathing system of honeybees that is a blood feeder. This is another parasitic mite that was introduced in 1987, and it is absolutely fantastically competent of vectoring viruses. And it feeds on blood of the immatures. Here they are. Over 18 viruses, very closely related to polio virus, coincidentally. They're single-stranded RNA viruses, and there's at least 18 of them. But there's several bacteria, some fungi, some of them sort of introduced fairly recently. Pesticides are quite ubiquitous in the environment, and up to about 18 different pesticides are exposing colonies throughout the country. Migratory stress, sort of closing bees up on a truck for 5 days or so across the country is thought to be a problem. Nutrition. So you think that we eat junk food. So sugar can be expensive. And so how do you keep honeybees alive when you're trucking them from California to Maine? You feed them high fructose corn syrup. It's a food that they're not used to, and it's been shown to be quite nasty to bees. And then the genetic diversity has an all-time low for honeybees. So this is an example of a fungus that causes dysentery. So this is diarrhea on the outside of a hive. So these honeybees are just being attacked from all sides. And so, as I mentioned, there was this emergency USDA grant for $5 million to try and solve this problem. And the long-term goal was to restore the health to managed bees, which was targeted at honeybees. And all of these states were involved, and I was involved in this at the onset, more as a statistician for the group. But I got involved in a project called the Stationary Hive Project in 7 states in different parts of the country. Ran an epidemiological study for 4 years, and we followed the fate of 30 colonies in each one of 7 states. And after sort of 3 different replicates of these apiaries with 30 colonies, we found that the site that you set up the apiary in was significantly related to the death rate of colonies. And we found that this was really due to pesticide exposure, that some areas that tend to be more agricultural, the bees get higher levels of pesticide exposure. This 1987 introduction, this varroa mite, was very important and is a relative risk factor of about 3.8, meaning about 380% more likely for a colony to die if it has varroa mites in it. Nosema, this is a fungal disease this particular species was introduced in the 1990s, brand new to the U.S. It also is resulting in about a 200% more likely chance that the colony will not make it if Nosema is in the colony. And then a brand new virus, which was also just first found in the 1990s, called Israeli acute paralysis virus. And it sort of increased the chance of death about 30%. So the picture emerged that, yes, the multiple stressor hypothesis seems to be right, and sort of in a correlative epidemiological study, that apiary site, probably due to pesticide exposure, a macroparasitic mite, a fungal microsporidian pathogen, and then a virus seems to be killing these colonies. And in fact, if you do not manage these colonies by medicating them to protect them from varroa mite, almost all these apiaries were dead in 2 years. So the death rate is incredibly fast. So this is sort of the kind of pressure that honeybees are under right now. So this hasn't changed, that honeybees will die very quickly, and as I mentioned, the demand for honeybees is increasing. Yeah?
I don't know what kind of analysis this is exactly, Frank, but does it allow you to say what percent of the variation is explained by this?
Yeah, sort of in a sense, this relative risk is giving you sort of the strength of the force of death, essentially.
So could you turn this into an R-squared and say that, you're able to explain a third of the variation in?
It's more than that. Yeah, the R-square, it's a very good model. It explains about 80% of the colony losses. Okay. So it's a very high predictor. So, as I mentioned, one of the initial sort of horrors with CCD is many people thought, well, what's happening to the other bees? Are honeybees sort of the canary in the coal mine? What's going on? Well, at the same time that we were running this epidemiological study, I had a graduate student, Sarah Bushman, who was looking at a lot of the native bees, and specifically bumblebees, and Kaylin Bickerman is in the audience, and she's continuing to look at the health of some of the native bees, especially bumblebees, since they're such a common bee in Maine. And we were looking for evidence that possibly managed bumblebees that are reared in Michigan and brought into Maine might be harboring pathogens, because it was believed that the parent company of the company in Michigan that sells bumblebees for commercial, mostly commercial greenhouses, but also blueberries, is in the Netherlands. And they brought some genetic stock over to the Netherlands, and it was thought that they picked up a very nasty pathogen in Europe, brought them back, and then distributed them all over the country. And that maybe our native bumblebees were picking this up. Well, we found really no evidence of that, although there is a species that is this blue bar from 1962, and then I started sampling in 1997, that used to be very common, Bombus terricola. Some people call it the golden-banded bumblebee. And in 2009, by 2009, it was very uncommon. You could still find it, but it just dropped off the face. This species, Bombus impatiens, which is a southern adapted bumblebee, in the 1960s, it was almost never found in Maine. It was the species that was made into this managed commercial bumblebee, and it's increasing now in the native population. And then there was another bee, the orange-belted bumblebee, which you saw before, which is common and sort of remains common. So we've lost very few species of native bees, but it seems like there's a community shift, that this once common bee is no longer found very often. Could it be climate change? Could be. But one curious thing, when Sarah Bushman did her study, she found that it was highly susceptible to a microsporidian pathogen, more than many of the other species. So is it a case that maybe there is something to the story that a very virulent strain of Nosema was brought in and collapsed this? But what's going on here with this species increasing? Is it maybe that it was released from competitive pressure with this golden-banded bumblebee? Or is it, again, climate change, that now you find it all the way up into the Maritimes, whereas in the 60s it was found in Massachusetts, was its northern range. So could there be just a shift due to climate change? We don't know, but there are some interesting aspects going on with the bumblebee population. As I mentioned, when we did this epidemiological study at each one of the apiaries across the U.S., we sampled bumblebees, and we looked for honeybee diseases in them. And Ann Averill at Massachusetts was spearheading this project, and we went out and collected bumblebees around the honeybee colonies. And this is a honeybee virus called deformed wing virus. This is one called black queen cell virus. And this column represents infections with both. And I should say they were thought to be honeybee viruses. Well, if we look at the mean for bumblebees collected in Maine, almost 80% of the bumblebees had this deformed wing virus. 40% had black queen cell virus, and about 35% had a dual infection. In Minnesota, similar, 64%, 76%, and 60%. And in Washington State, on the West Coast, we had 76%, 93%, and 72%. So then the question is, are honeybees that are just loaded with these filthy diseases which are bringing them down, are they actually contaminating flowers maybe when they visit flowers? And then are the native bees picking them up, and are they becoming infected? This is all work done with molecular markers, so it's not necessarily proving that there's pathology there, but just that they have evidence of having viruses. So still, no one's really done the work yet to find out whether these viruses that seem to be in the native bee community are causing premature death or affecting their foraging. But maybe what's happening with the honeybee is something that we should be more concerned about. So 2 years into this project, which I'll talk about, and I say, or even cowgirls get the blues because honeybees are not doing well. They're not very, very healthy right now, and it's very difficult to keep them alive. So in 2010, a group of us got together in the Northeast and decided to look more intensely at pollination services for crops in the Northeast. And so Maine, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York, we met and got some funding from the USDA to put together a proposal. And then we also involved a bee taxonomist in Maryland, and then a multimedia publicist in Tennessee. And so the USDA funded this grant, which is about $7.5 million, and it focused on the major bee pollinated crops of these states. So Massachusetts, cranberry, North American crop, very important to Massachusetts. In Connecticut, we have squash, another North American plant that's managed as a crop. Maine, Lobish blueberry, another North American crop. And as I said, as American as apple pie, apples maybe should be a North American crop. So these were the four crops that were looked at in terms of, is pollination sustainable for these crops? They're very important to the economies of these states. And so this investigator team involved several investigators from Maine, from Massachusetts, an insect ecologist that was very interested in pesticide and pathology of native bees, a virologist, an insect pathologist also at UMass, and an economist who's looks at more consumer behavior. In Connecticut, there was an entomologist that studied bee biology and squash. And we also have an analytical chemist who does all of the pesticide work for us. And then at Cornell, Brian Danforth is a bee systematist and ecologist who works in the apple system. And then John Skinner with Extension in Tennessee was brought in to set up a website for our outreach, but also make some videos. The Maine people are actually quite extensive number. So I'm involved in there as a pollination ecologist and bee ecologist. And George Kreiner has been involved in looking at the relationship between bee density and yield. Allison Dibble is a botanist and also pollination ecologist who's on the project. And Sam, who's in the audience, is our anthropologist and geographer to look at perceptions of pollination and pollinator security. Erin Hoshide is an ag economist, and I've got sort of pictures of everybody here, but probably too small to really make them out. Cindy Lofton is a landscape ecologist in the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Unit, and she's in charge of much of the landscape modeling. David Yarbo is an extension blueberry specialist, and he sets up a lot of the meetings for outreach with growers and also helps with recommendations. And then we have two new additions. We have Dr. Lois Stack, who's a horticulturalist, who's very interested in bee pollinator plants that nurseries can produce, especially native plants. And then Tim Waring is going to join the project, looking at maybe some human ecology and decisions maybe that farmers and government officials might make in policy. But the meat of the project are, of course, the graduate students who are doing much of the research. And so Eric Asari here, actually from Ghana, just left to go to Virginia Tech, but he did a project that we had about 6 years of data for economic modeling of blueberry pollination. And Alex Badgick is looking at the blueberry ecophysiology as it relates to pollination and reproductive growth. And Kayland is looking at bumblebee health, both looking at pesticides and pathogens. Lee Beers looks at blueberry genetics, and he doesn't look directly at pollination, but knowing the sort of genetic structure of plants and their reproductive biology is intensely important. Sarah Bushman has been studying pollinator ecology and looking at essentially pollinator communities. And then Shannon Chapin has been doing some habitat modeling for pollinators. Courtney Collum is looking at the anthropology of pollinator use. Brianne Luz is looking at fine-scale linear features in the landscape, such as power lines and roads and how they might affect pollinators. Eric Venturini, who's here, is looking at habitat enhancement with pollinator seed mixes. And then we'll have 2 new graduate students starting in 2014. So we've got a lot of different people looking at different aspects of this issue. And we're trying to get a socio-ecological student, PhD student, to maybe enhance some of the work that Sam Haynes and Aaron Hoshide are doing. And then also someone to pick up where Eric Venturini's leaving off on enhancing pollinator habitat in the state that's mostly forested, that's really suboptimal habitat. And I just have a couple more slides, and then I want to open it up to a little bit of a discussion. But this this sort of network are the areas that in Maine we're really sort of focusing on. And if I look at just a couple, if we look at anthropology and the economics, it's very farmer-based. We do a lot of interviews. And Sam, did you say that sort of Courtney has already done about 36 or 40 face-to-face interviews? And I know Aaron has done a lot of economic interviews with the farmers. So it's very farmer-based, but at the same time, we are looking at the economics of fruit set and yield, and how sort of looking at the value of honeybees and wild bees and trying to come up with economic decision-making models. Because as honeybees are increasing and their importance in blueberries, you can see that it's becoming more and more unsustainable. And so native bees are a natural resource that these farmers are likely going to have to take advantage of more in the future unless things drastically change with the honeybee, and it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. But so this anthropology and economics is looking at sort of the farming system, the type of production system, whether it's organic or high input. But also we're with Cindy Lofton trying to tie in landscape effects. So looking at economics over the landscape in Maine and look at how that affects yields, and also wild bees and honeybees. And so this is some of the links of the anthropology and economics. So they're really embedded fairly well in this project. They're not just, when I first started writing grants with the USDA and you're required to have an economist, it was just sort of a tag-along feature, but now it's really a central part of this project of understanding things. If we look at, let me see, how did I do that? I think that's, what I wanted to do. I don't know if I can. So I'll just show you. So we've had, as I said, this media consultant come up from Tennessee, and he spent a long week with us. And I don't know. I thought just by plugging this in, it would turn it on. But so here we are out on the Blueberry Barrens, and this is a very unique ecosystem. So you probably don't want to listen anymore to me, but you've been listening enough to me. But we sort of interviewed.
Wait for another week, maybe. So they
we
need
interviewed
groceries.
Beekeepers who are
stuff
trucking
moving
bees
around,
across
raining,
from the other side of the country.
83. And back
We
then,
interviewed our
we were
state
bringing in
apiculturalist
29,000
who
hives a
is
year.
concerned about the health of honeybees in the state of Maine, and
Any of them show any promise?
and then large
of
farmers,
blueberries?
organic
I think
farmers,
that
sort of
they,
a cross-section of the
have a
community
liquid
of
promise.
different blueberry farmers.
Just a different way of
This is a
planting
large-scale
fields,
farmer
that sort of
that's
thing.
now
So
toying with the idea of
we
using
have to change
bumblebees
our
in order to
approach
try
and
and
strategy.
buffer themselves from
Leaf cutters,
increased
totally different
costs
site
of
B.
honeybees.
I think they're still a good alternative. Just
So, And then I was going to say, but this diagram doesn't really sort of give justice to some of the dynamics we have here. And so one aspect we've been looking at fairly heavily is bee habitat, the idea that, sort of build it and they will come. That maybe we can essentially provide better habitat for bees and will increase their numbers. And this is one of Eric Venturini's pollinator planting plots, and we've been looking at whether in fact that is the case. If you plant these fairly substantial acreages near blueberry fields, does it increase their numbers? And so this is sort of a forage planting. But we're also looking at power lines that many of you may know. They're cutting a lot more power lines through Maine. And through vegetation management, power lines tend to be places where you get a lot of herbaceous plants, and the plants are kept in sort of primary succession. And so you get flowering plants, and is that going to generate enough bee forage? Depending on the distance to blueberry fields, that will result in more wild bees in the field. So we're going to be looking at this, and this is really a function of also of where in the state you might be at. And then looking at sort of the farmer's choices on whether they want to plant or whether they want to just maybe mow adjacent wild areas next to the blueberries. And so what are their perceptions, and what kinds of decisions will they make? And so far, we've come up with some information. We've quantified the economic relationship between bee density, both honeybees and native bees, and yield. And so, for instance, we have significant relationships, although you can see extremely noisy. Each one of these points is an individual field for a given year between honeybees and native bee density, and they tend to operate independently, so you can develop a model for both groups and allow farmers to come up with some strategical decisions on how much should they invest in honeybees relative to native bee densities. But this is a little graphic from a paper that just came out in Frontiers in Ecology and Environmental Sciences by Nancy Grimm, and it talks about some of the major environmental shifts that are taking place in North America, and it shows sort of lots of bark beetles and wildfires in the west, a biome change. The boreal forest is moving further north, more rainy weather, having sort of streams that are flooding more often. And so how does that maybe affect us, and do we have any data at this point? I already talked about how maybe we're having a shift in bumblebee species. But we sort of modeled, this is right now just based on Bangor data since 1960, and we looked at whether the springs were getting warmer and whether bloom time for blueberries was changing in terms of heating degree days, and it doesn't seem to be. But certainly the data bears out this idea that things are definitely getting more wet, and they're getting wet in the spring in Maine. And what this shows is the number of days of bloom time, and it ranges from 25 down to 10. And what it shows sort of in about 2000, you can see that there's a gradual decrease in the amount of time that bees would have access to pollinate the crop. And so this sort of really could drive the economic decisions of whether farmers should rely on native bees, but may need higher densities of native bees because you have less time to pollinate the crop, or maybe you should bring in more honeybees, depending on the cost of honeybees. Plastic response of the plant, and have a PhD student who's working on the plant's ability to partition resources into vegetative growth or reproductive growth. And what we find is that blueberries tend to produce lots of flowers, and the idea is that they do this to attract pollinators in, especially if in their natural setting, if they're in an area that maybe you have a blowdown in a forest and you have a small patch of blueberries and they need to attract lots of bees. And as the numbers of flowers increase on a stem, this is the numbers of flowers that are initially set as fruit from pollinator visitation. But what this is the numbers of fruits that remain by harvest. And you can see that the strategy of the plant is to have lots of flowers, and if they are set by lots of bees, then to drop them, drop the fruit, and only bring a certain number to maturity. And this was on sort of 2 different individual plants or clones. Just this past summer, what Alex did was he experimentally manipulated 16 different plants, and he reduced the numbers of flowers by 70% in this case. And these were the controls that weren't manipulated at all. And what it shows is when you reduce the number of flowers, they actually have more energy, and they're more likely to hold on the fruit. And so you actually get more fruit, more reproductive biomass and fruit by the end of the summer. And this is something that would be very important in pollination, because growers right now, they use a lot of fertilizers, they try to maximize the number of flowers, they maximize the number of bees, and yet they may be just down here, because a lot of these plants are dropping all the fruit. And so it may be that they can be much more sustainable if they lower their inputs and don't have to depend on as many bees. So the plant physiology plays into the pollination aspect too. And then landscape. And Cindy Lofton and Shannon Chapin have been looking at modeling the blueberry growing down east area and looking at floral resources based on various landscape covers, and also soil types for soil nesting bees and for cavity nesting bees in terms of standing woody debris. And what these graphs show is the red are where you would expect to get high densities of bees. And then this graph shows total pollinator abundance, and the red, again, being the higher abundance. And these landscape models had an R-square of about 58%, suggesting that you can predict bee community diversity with landscape cover. It's a major driver. And that at the field level, the amount of clear-cut conifer forest around the blueberry field is associated with higher bee densities, as is deciduous forest instead of coniferous forest. And fields that are isolated tend to have higher bee densities than fields that are in a huge agricultural area. And the last thing I'll just report on is Sam and his graduate student Courtney have been doing quite a bit of work surveying growers and trying to determine what their take is on pollination security. And he finds that many of the growers feel that wild bees are incredibly important. Many of them feel that 50% of the yield are due to wild bees. But they realize that native bees fluctuate. So they have a fairly good understanding of population dynamics, and that these native animals aren't constant. But some years they can be high, some years they're low. And so they're aware of this uncertainty, but despite this, many of them have high levels of adoption to conserve bee numbers. And some of them might be as simple, back about 20 years ago, I had a 4-year study where we looked at if you provided artificial nesting habitat for a certain group of bees called leaf-cutting bees that nest in sort of elderberry and plants with soft pith in the stems, that you could deploy these along the edge of your field and actually create nesting habitat and increase the numbers of leaf-cutting bees, suggesting that they were limited in their populations by the amount of nesting site. And some growers actively pursue that. Okay, well, I'm going to end here just sort of talking about policy. We had nothing about policy in this project when we started, and we really still haven't formulated anything. We have recommendations, and we talk with growers and have workshops with farmers about sustainable pollination practices. But we don't have anything in policy, and I think this has hurt us. So for instance, there's a new bill that's going to be introduced in a month, which involves having a moratorium on a particular insecticide that tends to find its way into the nectar and pollen of plants because it's highly water soluble. And so there's a lot of opposition against it, but a lot of support, especially from the environmental community. But UMaine was never consulted about it, and maybe it's because no one knows about University of Maine. I don't know, but it seems to be a reoccurring theme that the legislature doesn't always come to the University of Maine to get input. And Galen's studying neonicotinoids, but I've been studying them on honeybees and bumblebees for about 7 years now, and yet, we're just not in the loop. And so this is something that we certainly need to work on, and I'd be very happy to hear from SSI about that. And then also, should pollinator habitat be a state concern, or is it only something that farmers should worry about? And what about municipalities? Should we encourage towns to be involved, and should there be maybe state incentives? So one thing in my town that always happens, clockwork, that in Maine, in many communities in central Maine, there's a real dearth of floral resources in July. And then floral resources pick up in August, and they're very abundant in the spring, but July is a real tough time for bees. Clockwork. Right after July 4th, many towns hire people on tractors with cutter bars, and they cut all the flowering vegetation on the sides of the roads. And in most of our communities, this is where the majority of floral resources are. And so they're inadvertently making the starvation even worse for bees. And so, maybe there's something here that municipalities can jump on board. I know they feel they have to cut the vegetation so people can see the traffic at intersections, but maybe there's certain times they can do it and not have the impact that they do right at that time. And then the idea about maybe getting sort of businesses. One of my dreams is Mount Hamden. I don't know if any of you have been by the giant landfill in Hamden. Should make a ski area out of it, but we haven't done that yet. But that is sown over entirely by grass. Wouldn't it be nice to do a study first to make sure that if you plant flowering bee resources, that there aren't toxic compounds taken up by them? But if not, wouldn't it be nice to have areas like that actually provide some sort of ecosystem benefit? So maybe, and they would get a lot of PR out of it. We're trying to work on Central Maine Power in terms of their power lines to get PR out of providing bee habitat, but it hasn't worked yet, I don't think. But so I'm going to end there, sort of. I will just end on this little note, because I said, or the unhappy tea party. I will say that there was a very instrumental and very loud blueberry grower that, upon learning about our project, went to a presentation that Sam gave and was just irate that we would have any social scientists involved in pollination and in anything to do with growing blueberries. And he made several calls to Susan Collins. I got calls from Susan Collins and wanted to know what was going on. And I told her that, how they were involved. And she said, oh, yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable. But he basically said he was going to call the USDA and have our funding shut off and just sort of went over the deep end on it. But it was just sort of caught me by surprise, because I've been working with blueberry growers for a long time and never sort of encountered that hostility. But he was just very, very much convinced. And I asked Sam about this. I wondered whether, in some ways we are kind of studying these blueberry growers almost like lab rats. We're surveying them, asking them what their perceptions are. Maybe there's some offense taken that they feel that they're part of the experimental units in the study and not sort of that, sort of more independent. I don't know. But it was interesting. It could just be a random stochastic event, but, interesting. Anyhow. So I'll end there, and I know we're almost time to go, but if there are any comments, questions, I just wanted to sort of give an overview of the project. And
Well, let's do this in two parts. Just thank Frank, and then whoever can stay. I have lots of questions, so I hope you guys can join us. Questions?
And bees are not like birds.
Well, I mean, honestly, though, there's a huge movement starting now in the Northeast about early successional habitats being one of the most limiting habitats for birds in the Northeast. People are looking at power cuts. And people are looking at the way that private landowners are working. This reforestation kind of pattern has
a lot of similarity
across different taxa.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
No, it's not hummingbirds. I'm sorry.
I hate bluebirds, by the way, I have to say, because you find out really quickly that if you have some bluebirds in an open meadow area, and you put these along the forest edge, and the bluebirds tend to sit on these, and when the bees come in and out, they just sort of take snacks of them. And so you have to put like nails on top or pie plates, sort of swinging in the wind above them, and boy, are they can be very problematic. Eating all our bees. Yeah.
So, Frank, clearly there's a crisis looming on the horizon for a lot of this space. And bees aren't, well, they're fuzzy, but they're not charismatic, I guess.
They're not.
So, would they ever be? Would anyone ever consider them as an endangered species?
I think so, because one of the silver linings out of this colony collapse disorder is that people rallied to save the honeybee. This animal that stings you, that could make your life miserable. People came out of the woodwork and wanted to start raising bees. The Maine State Beekeepers Association, its membership increased from like 200 to now it's almost 600 people. So I think that maybe is some really positive energy that came out of this nasty situation of honeybees, which may flow over to native bees. But you're right. It's not like saving something that's cuddly.
Well, we spend, there aren't any fisheries people in here, so we're spending millions on Atlantic salmon. But proportionally, sort of we call them the grander societal benefits of pollinators makes the value, sort of the economic, ecological value of salmon pretty puny. But they get all, but for whatever reason, they get a lot more attention.
Yeah. I think a lot of it's the
And they
charisma.
blame
Vertebrates.
They blame the blueberry growers too for killing salmon. Some of them do.
Yeah. But, there's school groups now that are getting interested in surveying bees and looking at bees. And it's a difficult thing. Many of the bees, so there's over 200 species. Many of them are extremely difficult to identify. But this orange-banded one is one that one could easily identify and make no mistake. So I've been thinking about, well, maybe we should get a citizen science project going with like 3 or 4 really unique bees that you can identify easily and have some sort of, broad spatial and temporal survey to begin to look at the bee fauna. Because right now we don't have good historical information on what things were like in the 1800s and early 1900s. So it would be nice to do that, but it's problematic if you just had people go out there, like the dragonfly survey, and try to survey the diversity. I don't think it would work. But I don't know, Eric, what do you think? You're doing a lot of identifications right now.
Oh, well, I was going to say actually that, yes, identification would be impossible if you don't spend months and months learning about it. But I was going to actually comment. I think that there's a lot of support for increasing the diversity, well, really for bee conservation. There's a whole society, the Diversity Society, Society for Bird Conservation. A large part of their campaign right now is for bees. There's a lot of farmers are really excited about bees. A lot of individuals, whether they're gardeners or what have you, are really excited about bees. There's actually a lot there. The Xerces Society just petitioned EPA to put almost a fitness on the endangered species. or was it the endangered species?
Yeah. Mhm.
So, I mean, there is.
Eric's been doing a lot of talks, and maybe Kaylin too, to some of the garden clubs around, and they are a very receptive group. So maybe these things slowly build. Yeah.
Yeah, Frank, a comment and then a question. Your comment is, couldn't help when you started, you were talking, things that you get patches smiling on you, in the historical context of her, what was it called, the Route Benefit of Insects, her talk to when she was president of the Ecological Society of America. Do I have that right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is just such a main, university main thing that you're doing. Which is interesting. Question that I thought I heard you say that at European colonization, you would have expected to be more university. Did I hear that?
Yeah,
And I was puzzled at that.
So some of the early writings of the first Europeans that came noticed that along the eastern coast that the forest was very park-like, and there were lots of fruits growing underneath the canopy, so that the Native Americans had done a tremendous amount of burning, had cleared the understory, had thinned the forest so there was light penetration, lots of berries were gathered, and in those systems they must have had lots of bee pollinators, otherwise they wouldn't be getting berries. And that was in several journals of early explorers commented on that. So that, but as you went farther west, then that wasn't the case. It seemed to be only along major riverine systems and along the coast that this massive clearing was done, really changing the landscape to what we know of it now. It was not along the Penobscot. It was not like what it is now. So really interesting. Right?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I was wondering, when you were talking about the growers who are aware of the potential services from the population, but also aware of stochasticity, is there enough redundancy across the different populations that native populations are actually buffered themselves? Do they synchronously have bad years?
They do.
Plus?
Yeah, again, I think I'm the only one in the country that has like an 8-year time series of looking at bee communities. So, and there is some individual fluctuations, and actually 2 years ago, this orange banded bumblebee had a massive crash, and the other bumblebees didn't. But I think that climate drives a lot, and so you get synchronous sort of ups and downs, which would be counter to what you would want to see if you had 100 species in there, but they were sort of staying the same.
And the Hymenoptera do such the work that there's no, moths or...
Yeah, there are some.
or
There are some moths and
flies.
yellow jacket queens in the spring, but they're just not for the crop pollination for blueberries. They have evolved to be pollinated by insects and exclude other insects, and they've done this to a fine art. And so other insects can't get the resources, and so they ignore blueberries a lot. It's very difficult for them. So they've been masters of reducing the number of insects so that they're not getting insects that visited other species depositing foreign pollen on the stigma. Good strategy, but not good when bee numbers go way down.
One last string of questions on it. But so in those sorts of systems, a lot of times when you have those kind of boom bust over short time spans, you can find redundancy with longer time periods where allowing your field to actually boom bust might maximize your crop yield over a 5-year average rather than trying to keep it consistent, which would actually end up with lower crop yields. Is there any thought that changing the scale at which your economies are working would be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, some people do that, and there are some farmers that do that. They tend to be those farmers that
have multiple fields, and they can sort of rely on that. If you just have, the trouble with blueberries, it only provides fruit pretty much every other year. And if you've only got one field and it's a low year, it could be a little problematic for you because you're not going to get another crop for 2 years. But Sam might have a little more insight into that, but there are many growers that just go with the flow, aren't there? And they sort of are in tune with the fluctuating profit.
Is using the native bee seed?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are some that just do that. They're lower yielding. Most of them but are willing to accept that. It's a very diverse industry.
Yeah.
But it is the yield on average for operating that sort of thing ends up being lower.
Yeah.
It doesn't, you don't,
It
it's
is,
not
but
compensatory and it's not increased.
it is. But so the secret to doing that is if you're an organic grower, you tend to get 6 to 7 times higher return. The crop's worth a lot more, and so if you have lower yields, it's not quite as bad. Plus, what we found is that landscape is a major driver around your field. And if you just happen to be in an area that the landscape is wonderful bee pasture, that there are some organic farmers that get state average yields. They're not like, way down there. So, location, location, location seems to be the case in Maine. That if you have a blueberry field embedded in the middle of coniferous forest down east, you're in real trouble. It's just not, you're not going to have a lot of great bee populations unless you plant some of their seed mix or something.
So this might be a long question, maybe you could do the short version and people want to hang around, they can. So the colony collapse disorder looks like one of these really nasty ecological systems where lots going on. And yet it's a really urgent problem that you kind of wish it was just one thing and you could do something about it. What are people doing? In other words, the fact that you came with this site effect was one of the key things, and even interaction terms with the site suggests that and I didn't quite know how you knew that was a pesticide effect as opposed to some other side effect.
Well, because we took lots of measures on what the site was, and that tended to be related to the actual decay rate.
Okay.
But in the short term, smuggling. Smuggling is rampant in this country, and they are smuggling illegal pesticides that they throw in the hive, mainly to control this parasitic mite, because it compromises the immune system of the honeybees, making it more susceptible to nosema, to viruses, and so by controlling the mite, that's the first step. And so right now, the mite has developed resistance to the miticides that were used. If you're a small honeybee keeper, have maybe 2,000 hives, you can actually manage the mites through labor. But if you have 40,000 colonies and there are 3 of you running this business, the only thing that you can do is lift up the cover and throw pesticide in. It's factory type production of honeybees. And so they're smuggling stuff outside the country. And we only know this because it shows up in honey samples and such. So that's doomed to fail. But on the horizon, there are some people who are very optimistic on what's called interference RNA technology. I don't know if you've heard about it, but they're small little pieces of RNA that are targeted to interfere with gene function. And so they've identified RNAi that interferes with a lot of the developmental genes of varroa mite. And the nice thing about RNAi is it can be fed in sugar syrup. The bees take it up, and then it passes into their body from their stomach. And it actually disrupts development of bees. It's very cheap. You can manufacture truckloads of RNA and put it in sugar syrup. And so some people feel that this is the key, that if they stack lots of target genes so the mite can't overcome it really quickly, that this is maybe a promising technology. We'll see. It's probably 10 years down the road. So I think what will happen is that we'll see a huge change in the industry. These guys that have 50, 60, 70,000 hives I think we'll probably go out of business. And so, but I think that's maybe a good thing. We'll have people who are doing better stewardship and that maybe have 500 hives, 1,000 hives, and they can manage it. There's a lot of, you can break the reproduction cycle of the honeybee for a short period of time, and that causes a drastic decline in mite populations. And there's several things you can do. So maybe that will help a bit. Pollinator plantings help because they've shown that honeybees that only have access to one species of pollen are more susceptible to pathogens. If you are like us and have a balanced diet, less susceptible.
Why don't we stop there? Thank Frank again for a great